Great. Welcome everybody to today's talk with Professor Helen Kennedy and Dr. Shelley Cobb as part of the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities data series. I'm Dr. Dan Ashton, a fellow in disparate data and unexpected evidence with the Institute. I'll do a quick introduction to the Institute before introducing our speakers. The Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities supports socially engaged, creative and critical research and champions the significance of the arts and humanities in responding to the most pressing crises of contemporary life. First, we lead on critical and interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the grand challenges and support research groups asking what it means to be well, how does technology make us, and how we can weather uncertainty. And secondly, we explore the roles that art, culture, and creativity play in contemporary public life. The Institute funds pilot and proof of concept research projects, enables and supports a range of focused cross-disciplinary conversations and events, such as today's, and brokers collaborative partnerships, placements, and innovative approaches to knowledge exchange. The series thus far has explored a range of topics relating to precious issues around citizen data, data civics, and data inequalities. And this is our third event, and a very warm welcome to Professor Helen Kennedy from the University of Sheffield. Helen Kennedy is Professor of Digital Society at the University of Sheffield, where she directs the Living with Data program of research. She is interested in how digital developments are experienced and how these experiences can inform the work of digital practitioners in ways that overcome inequalities, so our focus for today. She researches perceptions of and feelings about datafication and the possibility of data-related agency, and she's interested in things like trust, equity, justice, and what the digital good might look like. Professor Kennedy has been involved with several projects, which we look forward to hearing about today. And on the website for the Institute on this page, there's a full bio with lists to those projects and publications. And joining us today to be in discussion with Professor Kennedy is Dr. Shelley Cobb, Associate Professor of Film at the University of Southampton. She's the Principal Investigator of the large AHRC-funded Calling the Shots, Women and Contemporary Film Culture in the UK, which produced data on the number of women working in the British film industry from 2003 to 2015, and 60 interviews with practitioners. So the format for today will be Helen's going to present, and then we'll invite Shelley to respond and then take it over for a Q&A. And I'll stop sharing the poster and give Helen a moment to set up her screen. Thank you.
Thank you. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I'll start. I can't see anyone or any chat or anything. I can only see my slides. So I'll pick up any questions afterwards. So thanks very much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm Helen Kennedy, and I'm going to talk about inequalities and life with data, drawing on Living with Data, which is a sort of 12+ year program of research, but also the name of a current research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And this is the team. I hope you can see a team slide in front of you. Somebody shout me if you can't. And Hannah Ditchfield and Monica Fratzak are here today as well, so hopefully we'll join in the Q&A. So as I said, I'm going to talk about inequalities and life with data. I'm going to start with a little bit of context. I apologize if any of this is kind of self-evident to any of you, but for those of you to whom it isn't, let me just say a couple of things about why I'm talking about the relationship between inequalities and life with data. So we know that inequalities shape lives. They also lead to different and differentiated groups and people more likely to be discriminated against in data-driven systems. And if you start in the top left of this slide, here's an image from the A-level result fiasco of 2020, where we caught a glimpse of the ways in which data-driven systems and algorithms can discriminate because pupils at state schools were disadvantaged by an algorithmic downgrading that didn't disadvantage pupils, more privileged pupils from private schools. And that, I think, really publicised the kind of inequalities that can result from algorithms here in the UK. Something that kind of publicised this issue a couple of years before in the US, if we go kind of clockwise around this slide, was a study by investigative journalists at ProPublica of the ways in which algorithms used in the criminal justice system were more likely to predict that Black people found guilty of committing crimes would reoffend than white people found guilty of committing the same crimes. So they found racial bias in the algorithms, the data-driven systems that were being used there. And the final example on this slide, if you get a chance to look at it, is from a really lovely spoken word poem by Joy Blomwini, which talks about, it's called Ain't I a Woman? And it talks about the ways in which facial recognition technology doesn't recognize Black women's faces as women's faces, again, because of ways in which discriminatory and unequal ways in which these technologies work. So how does this happen? How is it the case that discrimination and produces equalities and is written into data-driven systems? Well, there's lots of ways in which it happens. I'm just going to sort of give examples from the first two on this list here in the interests of time. So one way it happens is through the data sets on which such systems are trained. So this is what happens in the Ain't I a Woman story. Facial recognition technology has not been trained on enough Black women's faces to recognize them as women's faces. So the training data sets play a role here. Another example that comes out of this book you can see here by Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, is about the use of proxies. So proxies are things that stand in for other things in data-driven systems. And what Eubanks talks about is how in some data-driven systems which detect risk of child abuse or neglect, things like being hungry, not having enough clothes or living in a cold house are taken as proxies of risk. Whereas what Eubanks points out is that these are often the conditions of poverty. So through the use of proxies like this, we see data-driven discrimination occurring and inequalities being either produced or perpetuated. So very, very sort of quick kind of bit of context there that tells us that there is a relationship between inequality and data. But the literature looking at these things tends to focus primarily on experiences rather than looking at perceptions and attitudes, thoughts and feelings, which is what we're interested in on Living with Data. And in contrast to that, literature that does look at attitudes and perceptions of data rarely focuses on inequalities, although that is starting to change a little bit. So we bring these two things together and we suggest that attitudes and perceptions on the one hand and inequalities on another hand matter. Bringing these together matters for a lot of reasons. To give you one example, it's claimed that there is currently a data trust deficit, and that's what the RSS says. So people don't trust data-driven systems. Why is that? You know, how can we kind of address that problem if indeed it is a problem? And one of the things that US sociologist Rua Benjamin tells us, looking at trust in other contexts, is that trust is a racialized phenomenon. It's something that relates to inequalities. And she talks about what she describes as the racial logics of trust as actually a problem of social justice. So groups of people may have particular experiences of systems that discriminate against them, and that results in an appropriate absence of trust, we might say. So here we can see perceptions and attitudes and inequalities coming together in a way that we're interested in investigating on Living with Data. So I'll turn to now talk about our Living with Data project and what we did and some of the things that we have found in relation to inequalities. So our aim has been to understand different people's perceptions of different data uses and how these can be improved. And I want to say that we use the term data uses as a kind of short and accessible way of capturing how data about people is collected, analysed, shared and used. It's a term that data scientists might find inadequate kind of to capture all these processes. But in our case, talking to ordinary people about their perceptions, we needed a phrase that was kind of accessible and comprehensible to them. And our research questions are, what do different people know and feel about specific data uses in different domains of everyday life? And what do fair data uses look like from non-expert perspective? So emphasis on difference and inequality, and also emphasis on fairness as well. And the methods we've used, we carried out a comprehensive literature review of original empirical research into public attitudes to data uses. You can find that on our website. Don't start a grant application saying there's no research on this subject, because it might get reviewed by me or someone else from the Living with Data team, and we know that's not true. There's been actually quite a lot. So that was the sort of foundation. We ran a survey twice with 2,000 people each time. We carried out focus groups and interviews with 112 people. And because we were interested in what people think about specific data uses, rather than sort of generalized and abstract questions like, what do you think about data? We adapted what was called a data journeys approach to produce accounts and visualizations of specific data uses or data practices in specific context. We partnered with the BBC and the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, and we also produced NHS data use accounts from other data sets that were available. So our team member, Jo Bates, developed this data journeys method as a way, as she puts it, of turning the kind of black box of a data-driven system into a grey box. So you learn a bit about how data works using particular techniques: interview, freedom of information requests, accessing publicly available data, and so on. Now, Jo would say that we adapted it so much for this project that isn't really the data journeys account and the approach anymore, but nonetheless, it was our inspiration. And as I said, we looked at 6 particular data uses. The 2 from the BBC are experiments in giving people more control over their own data. So BBC Own It is an app that a child can download on their phone, and it will give them alerts if they look like they might be sharing their data with a stranger, might be saying something that could be construed as bullying, looking up something that might seem kind of risky or threatening. It gives them alerts. All the processing happens on the phone without the data leaving the phone. BBC Box is targeted at adults. It's a way of people deciding what data about their media consumption gets shared for the purposes of recommendation. The 2 DWP examples are both sort of making a shift to online identity verification instead of having to kind of go into a job centre or DWP office with pieces of paper. And we produced one of the NHS COVID data store because we did this research during COVID. And the final NHS one was built on our team member Itzel's PhD research that she'd done about kind of data uses in the NHS. So in these surveys, we shared textual accounts of these data uses, but in the focus groups and interviews, we shared visualizations as kind of elicitation tools to get the conversation going. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. I'm not really going to give you enough time to absorb them because I want to kind of move on and say things about what we found. I also want to say that the sort of beautiful simplicity of these visualizations produced by our team member Lulu Pinney masks the incredibly complex iterative process process of us disagreeing amongst ourselves about exactly what happens to data that led to the production of these documents. And that process tells us something about the complexity of data uses. But anyway, here's a couple of examples. So here's BBC Own It, an app that a child downloads. The orange circle tells us that the processing all happens within the phone. The data doesn't leave the phone, but the BBC is wondering about whether to share any anonymised and aggregated data with university researchers down the line to help them kind of evaluate well-being, children's well-being, things like that. And here's the second example. This is the NHS COVID data store. And here we see where all of the data comes in, processing happens. It's useful to governments and the NHS making decisions about how to manage a pandemic, but the blurred out bits are things that we don't know. We know that a bunch of commercial companies, Palantir, Amazon and Microsoft, provided some of the infrastructure. We don't know how much access to data they have. That became a bit clear during the process of doing the research as kind of organizations lobbied for more clarity and sharing of contracts with these organizations. So anyway, that's what we did. Okay, I also want to highlight, before kind of making 3 points about inequalities, that we sampled and recruited with inequalities in mind. So as I said, we ran the survey twice with 2,000 people each time. And whilst the sample was largely nationally representative, there were also boosts of people in particular demographic groups so that we could consider their perspectives and compare their perspectives with other groups within the survey. And they were people born outside the UK, LGBTQ plus people, and people in receipt of universal credit, which was partly interesting because we were working with DWP, but also partly interesting as it's a marker of low income. And in the focus groups and interviews, most of which were done online because this happened during COVID, we recruited 42% of our participants were from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, 42% earned less than 19,000 a year, 36% identified as having a physical or mental health condition, and 19% identified as LGBTQ+. And I want to say that COVID conditions makes it even harder to reach groups because we were all locked down. So this represents fantastic work by Hannah, who's here and can maybe say a bit more about it, to recruit such a diverse sample. And we reproduced a resource about doing research about inequalities in times of COVID that you can find on our website that sort of unveils a bit of the process that we went through. Okay, so inequalities. I'm going to say 3 things about inequalities, and then I'm going to do some sort of reflection on that, and then we'll open up for discussion. So the first thing I want to say is possibly a bit obvious, given the kind of framing that I did at the beginning and what we already know about inequalities. Structural inequalities shapes the experiences that people have, and that in turn feeds into people's perceptions of data uses. This is what we found from the survey. We found in relation to education that people with the lowest qualification reported the most uncertainty with regards to their awareness of whether data uses, data practices do or don't take place. Surprise, we found that women gave more don't know answers to awareness questions, knowledge questions than men. Not really a surprise. In relation to ability and disability, we found that disabled people were more positive about the statement, I support the reuse and sharing of health data for research purposes, than people who didn't have a disability. With regard to race and ethnicity, we found white people trust the police with their personal data more than people who are not white. With regard to sexuality and gender identity, we found that LGBTQ plus people trust health professionals with their data less than heterosexual cisgender respondents. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that actually these demographic differences were not that significant. This is an example of some of the things that we found, and it sort of, I think it masks kind of complexities around intersections, but it's to give you a kind of taste of what we found. We did find some demographic differences, but they weren't hugely significant. We actually found that other differences matter. For example, degree of prior awareness of data uses, which intersects with things like education and age. So that's what we found from the survey. From the focus groups and interviews, we found that perceptions of data uses seemed to be influenced by age, education, economic status, disability, gender identity, race and ethnicity, having English as an additional language, and sexuality. And I'm just giving you one example here. So in all cases, I'm giving you very, very small quantities of examples to illuminate the points that I guess you have to trust me on. So here's a quote from Ellis: white, British, bisexual, non-binary person, aged 25 to 34, with an annual household income of 30 to 39,000, who has a postgraduate level education. So Ellis says, there's some things I don't disclose honestly, like medication, because they'll ask you, like, are you taking any regular medication? But if I perceive that the fact that I'm taking hormones isn't relevant to them, I won't let them know. So I'll just lie about it. I'll just be like, right, it's easier for me if I don't mention that and just try and not flag up being trans at all, like at the opticians or at the dentist, or like things like that. I get a bit paranoid that people will treat you differently, and not necessarily in a bad way, just that they will realise, and it will just feel there will be a shift and they'll treat you different. So Ellis's experience as a non-binary trans person led them to regard certain data processes or data gathering processes with caution, choosing for themselves what data to share and what not to share, based both on experience, which informed perception. So that's one example of the ways in which inequality shape experience, and that in turn shapes perception. Another thing that we want to highlight here is that intersections of inequalities were really important. Now, this is something that some writers have written about. So Safia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, is about the intersection of race and gender. Eubanks' book is a lot of the time about the intersection of race and class, though they're primarily focused on poverty. And what we are doing here is kind of broadening the range of important intersections that we find in our research. And here's a quote from Goulet, a Turkish-born heterosexual woman, aged 35 to 44, a student on a lower income. And she's talking about providing data into systems, particularly in the context of welfare, so the Department for Work and Pensions, and how difficult this is for her because English is an additional language, but how simultaneously how important it is to be careful about the sharing of her data because she's a refugee and is concerned about that data getting back to her own country where she doesn't feel safe. So these two aspects of her identity combine. She says, this is hard for me because it's in English and long. I know that if I don't accept, I can't continue, so I just accept. I'm a refugee. I come to this country because of problems in my country. I don't want my location to be shared with the Turkish government. This is important for me. I know this country is safe and it's okay, but I don't want to share this with any other countries. So that's an example of what we found about the really significant kind of intersections of inequalities. So I'm going to move on to my second point now, going through probably a bit fast in order to enable time for discussion. So a really important thing we found is that people who don't belong to disadvantaged or minority groups are still worried about inequalities, and perhaps more so than people who are in those groups. So we found this overriding concern about inequality, not only amongst people who have lived experience of it for themselves. So, for example, on our survey, we found 86% of respondents were concerned about data uses being used in unfair ways, and we found this kind of concern about inequality in our focus groups and interviews. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So this is the visualization of a DWP process called Confirm Your Identity. So it's online identity verification, where what the DWP does is it goes to other systems. It could be the passport agency, it could be the Home Office, it could be the tax office, it could be a finance agency or a bank, to confirm that you are who you say you are. And what concerned people about this was the fact that people with complex lives who might not have a job or a bank account or a kind of consistent home or have paid tax will find it harder to participate in this system than people who that doesn't apply to, which is not to say that the paper-based way of verifying identity wasn't also complex for those people, but the possibility of such a system kind of entrenching inequalities was the thing that most concerned people about it in our survey. And we can see that point illuminated in this quote from the focus groups and interviews by Ruby, a British Chinese woman who's heterosexual, aged 18 to 24, working in legal services, has a postgraduate education, an annual household income of 40 to 49,000. So she says, if someone doesn't have a P60 or a passport, but then that makes me think those people don't have a P60. Is it more people that have jobs that are cash in hand, for example, don't have a passport, maybe they've never left the country? If you've never been abroad and have a cash in hand job, it makes me think that people that are closer to the poverty line have to part with their data more than people that have like a P60, and that's really unfair. So we see these kind of concerns about the fairness of data uses being really strongly linked to concerns about inequalities. So I'm going to move on to my third point now. So one of the things that we found in our research was that participants often looked beyond what we told them or showed them in our accounts and our visualizations of data uses to imagine various things, which is, partly gutting for us because we thought we'd done a fantastic job of telling a story about a data use in our visualizations. Now, by imagining, what we mean is building or creating a mental image of something that's not present at the moment of imagining. We're not suggesting that participants imagine things that were imaginary, like only in their imagination. What they did was they filled the gaps, even if there weren't any. And we think that historical data misuses, security breaches, and lack of transparency about data use meant that participants assumed there must be information missing from the accounts of data uses that they encountered. And as a result, they imagined various things. The experiences of people more disadvantaged than them, which I just talked about, they imagined what might change, what might happen to data in the future. And they imagined differences between data uses as they are said to work in theory and how they might actually work in practice. And sometimes this was based on their own experiences. So this is a kind of big finding of the research, but we also found that inequalities shaped these imaginings. I'll present you with an example here from Matthew, a white British gay man with a degree who works in web development and has an annual household income of £20,000 to £29,000. And this is him imagining what might happen to data in the future. He's talking about the census. So we just had the census, and I think sexual orientation and gender identity, it was the first year it was on the census, and obviously that's really important in order to provide public services. But, if the government knows I'm gay, for example, and a particularly right-wing administration comes in, they know where I live, they know who I am, they can make it a legal requirement for companies to share that data with government. They could very quickly arrest me or whatever. That has crossed my mind. I mean, it seems like a sort of dystopian fantasy, but at the same time, it's possible. So let me just say a couple of things by way of conclusion about kind of what we make of some of our findings, which we're still analysing, by the way. We haven't come to the end of our thinking about our data. So the first thing I want to sort of just say something about is our methods. So we think that you can't ask people to formulate an opinion about a data use or a data practice if they don't know about it and they don't understand about it. And because of that, in all of our research, we've provided people with potential benefits and potential harms of each data use. So what and of our 6 data uses, 1 harm related to inequalities. And that was the possibility of people with sort of complex lives not being able to participate in the DWP's Confirm Your Identity system. However, that's 1 of 6. And anyway, inequalities came up organically in conversation, in focus groups and interviews before we brought up the topic of benefits and harms. So we note that we did mention inequalities in 1 out of 6 cases, but in all cases they came up anyway in the conversation. So we think that it's reasonable to conclude that people are concerned about them. But with that said, I do think that if you are interested, you know, you need to have a kind of methodological orientation towards understanding the intersections of data and inequalities to find out about it. So, you know, you saw that in how we sampled and recruited, you saw that in what our aims and our research questions were, and that was also present in what we said to people. And I think it's important to say that because I have been involved in conversation with people that do research on public opinions of data uses who say, I found that no one minds, you know, no one's bothered about any of this. And my response to that is, well, what was your aim? Who were your target group? What did you ask them? What do they know? In order to sort of express their opinions. So we think there's a sort of important kind of methodological point there. With that said, people did express concern about inequalities. They voluntarily talked about inequalities. And we might see this as people decentering data, which is a term used by Sita Penya Gangadharan and Jedred Niklas. And what they're saying is, look, if we want to find out about the role of data in relation to sort of politics and inequality, you have to start with the politics and the inequality as researchers, not start with the data. And what we're finding here is that participants are doing that for us. They are connecting data back to the social and political reality from which they're produced, which is a quote from Catherine D'Ignacio and Rahul Bhargava. So, you know, we're making a space for people to talk about what matters to them. We find what matters to them is inequality, the social and political reality within which data is situated. We find multiple and diverse relationships and intersections between data and inequalities. And so we which expects to find inequalities everywhere, and that decentering data is kind of a good concept to start with, but we might need to move on from that somewhat. So those are kind of initial and not fully formed thoughts. I'm going to end it there so we have a chance for conversations. So hopefully I will stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Shelley. Is that good? Have I stopped sharing my screen?
Yes. That's all good.
Good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. Dan, did you want to jump in first or?
No, not at all. That was wonderful. Thank you. Shelley, please, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to talk a lot because I'm sure people have loads of questions directly for Helen. and I'm here partly just, I guess, as in some ways as this well, not a counterpoint, but my own work on data was, as Dan said, been collecting the data on the numbers of women who work behind the camera in the British film industry over a period of time. And I just, so this is sort of a producing data rather than sort of collecting data kind of thing. But I was just interested in the many things that you said about perceptions of data that are different, but I think are still an issue that came up after we did our data collection and how we presented it and how it was perceived when we presented it, and the kind of different kinds of pushback that we got from that. So I just wanted to briefly link that to the presentation of data itself in terms of things like simple things like not using pink and blue to to distinguish between men and women, and using different colors, and the ways that in some of the data that we collected, women of color were so few that we had to statistically, it made more sense to bring them put their kind of numbers together rather than individualize them even more specifically, because we collected the numbers of women and also identified their race, but putting them collectively together became quickly problematic because people wanted more clear-cut intersectional identities, and finding ways to, and the perception that it made them feel of being kind of cut out of the data by not having that more detailed level of presentation, and trying to adapt to that, and also the kinds of amounts of the other gaps, quickly identifying the gaps and the things that we were able to collect, and the ways that made them feel kept out of the data and the uses that it was being put to, and those kinds of perceptions. And just one last little thing, sort of on the other side of the positive of the people you surveyed having very kind of more positive or critical thinking about inequalities beyond themselves. The way we present data that focuses on in the arts and humanities in the film industry, some of that presentation of data from me and others has focused on the numbers of women, and I think some of the effect that has contributed to seeing women and marginalized people as the problem that needs to be fixed and trained up to do better in the industry, rather than the industry realizing actually maybe the people who need to be changed are the ones who are in charge and who are dominating the white men who are making all the films, who are kind of able to kind of skirt out of what the kind of issues, like they don't need to be trained. It's the falling back on sort of perceptions and assumptions and stereotypes of inequality, of why women and marginalized other groups weren't doing well in the industry was their fault, whether it was because they were choosing to have babies or not having enough training, etc. And that ways that perceptions of people's, in a different other side of the way people's inequalities or lack of inequalities can color their perception of their relationship to data. So from that different side, but yeah, your emphasis on people's experience of data collection is extremely fascinating and so important right now in the ways that we're all anxious about data collection from our government and others. I'd be keen to hear what others have to say. I want to ask Helen about that.
Thank you very much, Shelley. So we've got a good amount of time for questions. So if you'd like to raise hands or indicate in the chat, we can do that. But whilst we're waiting, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about how you're connecting your paper. So if there's anything there, Helen, that you'd like to return to on Shelley's points, then we've certainly got time for that. Thank you.
Can I ask, Helen, in the beginning you talked about the women lacking awareness relative to men, and you said that's obviously we would have expected that. Do you mind expanding on that a bit?
Yes, because very importantly, it wasn't that they lacked awareness, it's that they said they didn't know.
Right, okay.
Men gave more wrong answers. So we gave a series of statements like, is this statement true or false? And we gave statements, and women, so you could say yes, no, like true, false, or I don't know. Women said I don't know more frequently. It's not that they lacked knowledge or awareness, it's a confidence issue, isn't it? Which I think is historical, especially in relation to sort of technological matters. There is consistent finding that women lack confidence, but in fact know as much as men. So
Yeah.
men knew, but they were wrong. But
Yes.
you know, they had the confidence to choose true or false, and didn't use don't know as much as women use don't know. So I think that's why I was sort of joking about being a surprise. I think that, you know, there is research in all sorts of fields that show that you know, I've done research on like web design 20 years ago and found that talking to web designers about their knowledge of HTML, for example, women would say, oh, I don't know very much, and men would say, oh, I know loads, and it would turn out that they knew the same amount. So it's about a sort of gendered framing of knowledge.
Yeah. That okay. That I figured it was
Yeah.
along those lines. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to respond to Dan, you know, sort of suggesting that I sort of respond to Shirley, I think that one of the overlaps that I see is this issue of where does the problem lie? Because in debates about trust, you know, that the sort of some policy orientation is that the problem lies with distrusting citizens, and you know what kind of, you know, a lot of people looking at things like sort of inequality and trust, or looking at things like, you know, public understanding of science, would say the problem lies in untrustworthy systems, and it's that's where the change needs to take place, and then you will find that, you know, trust follows. So there's a ethicist who talks about morally proper distrust. So it, you know, sometimes distrust is the right response, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there is, you know, the BFI, the British Film Institute, collects data on diversity, and people are making films in order to say that they're going to promise to have a certain amount of you know, women or people of color in order to get funding, and the outcomes of that, you know, aren't always publicized very well, and aren't then sort of followed up with. And so there's a general distrust of like, well, what is this data doing but making you look good? You know, and again, so where does the problem lie in terms of people's trust of, you know, the collection of data and what the value in doing that?
Thank you. We have a question from Valentina. Thank you, Valentina.
Hello. Hi, Helen. Thank you. That's such a great talk. I mean, I want to come back, and the project is amazing. And of course, I'm a little bit familiar with it, but obviously this has been great. I wanted to go back to that point that you made, that this research and the kind of content is political, and I certainly very much agree with what you're saying. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about, I mean, apart from the obvious, which you've already clarified, but I wonder whether you could say something a little bit about whether there are going to be policy implications or policy recommendations at the end of the research tunnel.
Yes, so we sort of reported along the way on different phases of our research. So we produced a report based on our literature review / evidence review. So that was very extensive. We produced a report based on our survey, and they included recommendations. And some of the recommendations are, so for example, we find, like, the survey had lots of elements that, you know, too many to sort of describe in a 30-minute talk alongside other things. But across various different bits of it, we find that people consistently don't like commercial companies profiting from use of data shared for more pro-social purposes initially. So, for example, in the domain of health. Okay, so one of our survey recommendations was to stop doing things that people consistently don't like. Like, if you don't want people to, you know, if you want to increase trust, if you want more sort of citizen buy-in, then people don't want Amazon and Palantir providing the infrastructure. I mean, you know, we ought to be realistic about the extent to which people will pay attention, but we can still shout about what we found, right? And another thing that we're finding across all of the elements of our research is that context really matters. Okay, so people are more bothered about inequality in the context of what the DWP do, because the DWP is providing a welfare service to people, you know, who are already disadvantaged and really dependent on welfare. So it's really important that they don't exclude. In our focus groups and interviews, we found people a bit less concerned about BBC data uses from an inequalities perspective, because they say you have a choice. You have a choice whether you download BBC Box. You have a choice whether you download the Own It app. So given that, there needs to be ongoing consultation with members of the public about different data uses. It can't be a one-off, and it can't be the case that findings from survey A are just assumed to apply to everything. So the government's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation has just started doing a tracker, public attitudes to data and AI tracker survey, which is going to do every 6 months. And we've worked with them a bit on that, and we've sort of encouraged them to use some of our survey questions in that. But my worry is that because it's a government department doing that, that they'll take that as the finding about public attitudes. And one of the things that we've said is that there needs to be a way of synthesizing the different findings of all this different research that is taking place on public attitudes. Another thing I would say, based on the presentation that we've given today, is that people really care about inequalities and disadvantage. So that needs to be addressed in systems going forward. It isn't just people who are disadvantaged and discriminated against who care. There seems to be fairly widespread awareness now that these systems can reproduce inequality. So that's off the top of my head. I could look at the reports and give you a more comprehensive list, but that's some examples of some of the things that we're saying.
Thanks, Helen. Dan, can I just follow up very quickly? Sorry. It's so interesting because I think at some point you said the people who didn't belong to any of these other identities didn't think that, I can't remember the statement itself, and the first thing I thought was, well, that will be a very small minority because we've already put in those others, you know, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, perhaps nationality, with the example of the Turkish, I mean, it's a push, but with the Turkish student. And so that would leave quite a small minority of people who actually held those views.
Yes, so the survey was nationally representative, except for some boosts in some areas. And so the sort of quantitative finding that 86% of people were concerned about data being used in unfair ways, I don't think kind of would have a minority of people who are not in disadvantaged or minority groups. Yes, that would be the case with the focus group. And in fact, I do want to bring Hannah into the conversation. And we've been talking about, you know, is it the case with most people? Like what quantitatively, what do we want to say about that? And to be honest, we're still analysing that data, so we can't say anything kind of definitive. But I take your point that if we've already sampled and recruited with inequality in mind, people that are not in disadvantaged and minority groups might actually be a minority in our sample. I think that's a fair point. But Hannah, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. One thing that was making me think is that often it's people who, I guess they are disadvantaged in one respect, but they don't acknowledge that in what they're saying, and they kind of bring out a different kind of characteristic. So, for example, kind of a lesbian couple that I was speaking to were kind of in the position of, well, we're okay because we're educated, we're well off, we live in the UK, we feel safe. But if you're not in this position, say if English is your second language, or you're a refugee, or you haven't been to university like we have, and they kind of listed other things. So it's not like they were people who kind of have never kind of experienced inequality because they had talked about that earlier on. But in the moment of that interview, they were saying kind of that doesn't matter for us at the minute, and actually I'm more concerned about other people in different positions to us. Does that make sense? Yeah, and that happened a few times.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, it makes complete sense. Thanks for that. That's actually, yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks both.
Thank you. Thanks, Valentina. Thanks, Hannah. Nothing in the chat, but I'll give a moment in case anybody else like to come in with a question. Hi, Shelley. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't want to hog, but it just found you that just exchange just made me think about the policy recommendations. Like, I wonder if it's a viable policy recommendation to simply ask to have, you know, identify people with inequalities be on the team, part of constructing the way data is collected, right? That kind of preemptive kind of you know, kind of basically prejudice trawl, or sort of, you know, that experience, like, right, and like who's, like, you know, we can imagine who's creating these things, etc. And would it even be of value to have sort of, you know, or to various people on that team, or to collect this information? Well, certainly to collect it ahead of time, but how would that be done? I guess is sort of what I'm just, if you're even thinking that far, it might be quite well beyond the parameters of what you're doing, but in terms of policy recommendations.
Yeah, I would say it is a bit beyond the parameters of what I'm doing. I'm working on another project with Jo Bates, which she's leading, called Patterns in Practice. It's AHRC funded, and it's about the sort of values and beliefs of people doing data mining. So that's more about the sort of people behind the scenes or doing data science. And I think that would look more at who are the sort of workers behind these systems. I would say, though, from this and other research, that who is doing the work is a really complicated question. It isn't straightforward. Who knows? Who has knowledge? I mean, the process of producing these descriptions of these 6 data uses tells us that there is no straightforward answer to that question. Like, who do we turn to for clarification about whether this happens or that happens on data use number 2? We don't know. They don't know. Oh, they left. Oh, they've changed the structure now. Oh, COVID. You know, it's not an easy thing to sort of, it's not as easy as it sounds, I think, to identify where we need that diversity. So maybe let's just say we'll have it everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
If I can, I'd like to turn to the focus groups, and I think it was Ellis's experience around what Ellis perceived to be relevant, and that made me think to what extent participants discussed the clarity of information that they would receive on how data would be used, whether it's a talking point at how clear various data collectors and processors established what it is they were going to collect the data for and how they would use it.
Do you want to go first, Hannah? I imagine we both got things to chip in. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So do you mean kind of, did we talk about how kind of easy it is to understand what happens to your data? Is that what you mean, Daniel?
Yeah, I think it was the point from Ellis that they perceived that it wasn't relevant, so they didn't want to give that information.
Right, yeah.
Onus on the data gatherers to actually, for them to make it clear what would be relevant and how it would be used, and kind of the shifting onus to those people to make it clear.
Yeah, I can't think of another example like Ellis in that sense. I mean, we had some examples of, because in a way Ellis reminds me a little bit of like kind of taking control himself, like he's kind of taken his kind of data into his own hands by making that choice of like, well, I'm not going to share this. So in a way it's kind of a form of agency in a way. And we had some other examples of kind of agency in terms of people making choices and decisions for themselves around what to share or what not to share. I don't know if that kind of links to what you were saying. I can expand if it is relevant.
I mean, I would just throw in there as well that sort of broadly on the topic of clarity of information, right? I think that what we found about the way people fill in the gaps, whether there are any or not, calls into question clear information as a solution, right? You know, I think I'm allowed to say that our visualizations were great because I didn't make them. Lulu made them. She's, you know, 20 years experience as a sort of infographic data visualizer. Participants were really positive about them. Hannah said they really, you know, thought they helped them make sense of things. But still, a lot of people's default was there must be something missing. There must be something going on here that I'm not being told. What am I not being told? What is missing here? And so, you know, we do make an argument as part of our kind of collective team effort that we need to kind of question this assumption that transparency, on the one hand, transparency of information, and on the other hand, literacy amongst individualized subjects is what is needed to sort of solve the understanding problem. Understanding is really complicated when it comes to data uses. All sorts of things are going on. People's kind of lived experience of inequality or lived experience of a data breach, their imaginings, the fact that everything changes, everything is dynamic, the data use is dynamic, you know, the information about it is, my opinion about it changes in the course of a focus group conversation. So I think that there's a sort of problematizing of the whole concept of clear information across a lot of what we've found. Do you think that's fair, Hannah?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I think what makes it even more complicated is that people still want clear information. They still said, oh, like what is give them clear information. They kind of go beyond that still. So yeah.
Thank you both very much. We're coming up to time, but I can see a question in the chat from Hayabala. Thank you for this amazing talk. I was wondering if you found out any motivations for people to share their data when they do that voluntarily, but you've already answered that. I think it depends on the context and their benefits, as you said. So I'd like to ask if you could mention decentering data a little bit more.
Can I just say that I'll briefly about the first half. Yeah. I think that the whole concept of motivation to share data is the wrong framing, because we don't have a choice. You know, we don't make choices about whether to share data or not. Data is extracted from things that we do. We have not chosen to share data. And so I just think that we need to frame our conversations differently and not in that way. So that's one thing. So in terms of decentering data, this is comes from a paper which if I could type and chat at the same time, I'd put the URL in the chat, but it's not going to happen. Sita Penya Gangadharan, who's at the LSE, and Jedreg Niklas. So what they're saying is, and they're not the only ones, Lena Densick has written about this as well, and I've written about it with other people, but building very much on their ideas. They're saying that if you want to find out about the place of data in the world, in life, in social life, the politics of data, its role in the reproduction of inequalities, don't start by talking about data. Start by talking about all of those other things, and you'll find where data fits in. So it's kind of a call to data studies researchers who are interested in data to not talk about data, to participants to sort of talk about other things and find where data fits. So it's a question about starting points, or a sort of argument about starting points. That's how I understand it. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much. When I said motivations, maybe it's because I was thinking about my own research topic, which is about smartwatches. So I was thinking some, people are voluntarily buy this kind of products and use them, but I think it depends on many elements and factors, of course.
People
Yeah,
voluntarily use the product and buy the product and use the product, but that's not the same as making a choice about whether to share data. And Ibala, the problem isn't in your interesting question there. The problem is like in policy framing, that it's the policy that needs to not talk about as if people make choices to share data. It needs to understand the whole, the infrastructure of data doesn't kind of operate like that. Yours is a nice question, and I do think if you're doing qualitative research with people about smartwatches, you will find that they say micro level choices about what they do and thinking about the consequences of what they do. So really, my comment was more to the policymakers than to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've come to time, but a really fascinating presentation, a really great discussion. So a big thank you to Helen and Hannah for joining us, and to Shelley for acting as our SIAH discussant. As I mentioned, the SIAH profile for this event has Helen's bio, and in that there's a link to projects and publications, as well as the ones that Hannah has added into the chat. But otherwise, perhaps we could either use the emoji clap or a hand clap to extend our thanks for all our speakers today. Thank you all so much. Take care, everybody, and thank you again for joining. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.